Hi everybody, thanks for hanging in there with us for a little bit. It took us a while to just get the technology wrangled, but we're up and running. I'm Michael Cohen and I'm speaking to you here from the Joint Avenue Creative Centre in Zetland, which is in Gadigal country. So I just wanted to, before we kick off, just acknowledge, we are in Gadigal country and you're all in your own countries, wherever they may be. So just wanted to acknowledge that and pay respect to the elders past and present, and any Aboriginal people who are with us today. So look, we've got a whole bunch of things to talk about. City People is an organisation that works in arts and culture, and we work with artists, we work with arts organisations, we work with developers, we work with local government and state government organisations. And what we're doing most of the time is trying to find ways to bring places to life and make them memorable through arts and cultural activities. And so that covers, what we do covers a whole range of things, from the strategy planning phase to the implementation planning, how are you going to do it, to the actual producing and programming of arts projects. And a lot of this happens in the public domain. So today we're going to talk about arts and culture in the public domain and do a bit of collective thinking and a discussion about why this particular time represents some great opportunities really for all of us to connect in the public domain through an arts and cultural activities during COVID and also whatever lies beyond. I know that many of you who are in the audience, and I've seen a bit of the list of who's here, work in arts and culture. You might work for local government, some people are artists. There's a whole different range of different people here. And it really is great to have you all here. And people sort of wrote their notes about what they were interested in and why they might be interested in this kind of work. And they range from, how can I connect with communities safely? How can we support artists through this process? Or just, as plain as how the hell do we do this? And indeed, how the hell do we do this? So in terms of what we're going to do today, in a moment I'm going to be talking with Fiona Winning and Chris Fox. Fiona's the Director of Programming at Sydney Opera House, and Chris runs a studio called Studio Chris Fox. He's an architect and an artist, and also working at Sydney University. And as you can see, they're in real life. We're in real life here. And we know that you were all in your lounge rooms or your studies, and you're probably in your pajamas still, but thank you anyway for joining us. So this is a collective conversation and we're really keen to hear from you. So if you have any questions, if you have any comments that come up throughout the process, please just put them in the chat, and we're going to leave a chunk of time at the end to come to those questions. At the end of today, we'll also email out a bit of a summary insight report that covers some of the insights of today and also from the accelerator that we've run. So the accelerator. Okay, so what is the accelerator? So an accelerator, the way that we run them is it's an intensive laboratory environment, and we bring together a team of key participants and we work collaboratively on coming up with innovative arts and cultural solutions to projects. Typically we've run these for 10 to 12 days, and they mostly tackle the goals of a very specific place. So we've run one in Wollongong City Council, for the council in terms of Wollongong City. We recently ran one for the West City Parklands. We've run them in the Rocks, we've run them all sorts of places. And really they're an innovative way to develop ideas over a sustained period that really focus, and so they're much more than people sitting down and getting a whole bunch of sticky notes and doing that for an hour. So look, we've got a bit of video that we're going to run, and it'll give a bit of an insight into the accelerator that we ran in August, and the video runs for about 3 or 4 minutes. So have a quick look at this and then we'll come back.
City People created the accelerator because we're actually an organisation that's about placemaking in the public domain, and in fact bringing people together in the public domain, and that's in fact one of the things that's diminished during the COVID crisis. And we thought that lots of important arts and cultural institutions and artists were grappling with how do they continue their practice, or how do they enable practice.
COVID-19 is a shared anxiety, and that's probably why it's so important to think about different ways to bring back arts, activities, and community-based events in our lives so that we can actually address that shared anxiety.
As we move through any space, as we enjoy events, as we listen to music, as we watch film, we don't often stop to reflect on how essential those things are to our experience every day.
You know, I think people are feeling really discombobulated and in many cases very anxious and lonely. So I think the power of art in that context is all about connection and well-being, providing people with great experiences, collective experiences.
We're sort of rediscovering our local spaces, and I guess I want to know, how do we bring arts and storytelling and connection into those local spaces?
Seeing how parks that were once used are now being reused again, because they represent a genuine open opportunity where you can physically distance but yet be together.
I think it's definitely changed the way in which public space is now used, the way in which we think about architectural or visual arts crossover, which is the work I do, and how in which that public space is then used in the future.
So there's a really lovely nexus that can happen if some ideas that come from the creative sector and the businesses can start to benefit as well.
I think it's been quite interesting to delve more into the idea of, again, not just thinking about how we're diminishing an existing experience or trying to just do something in a different way, but it's about how can we actually use this time and these challenges to create an ideal new normal, something that pushes the boundaries, that thinks about intimacy in a new way, something that explores avenues that we may not have had the time or space to consider before.
It's possibly going to be a great thing for dance and people being able to move and be outside, because we're not being able to do that at the moment.
So everybody's really engaging in this digital sense right now, and so what's happening is our city streets are empty. So I think if we can really think about how we can collaborate with each other, work together to create work that may sit in a street with a very small number of people perhaps, or seated.
Something that's come out of this accelerator has been that people want to meet in real life and want to experience each other and arts and culture in real life. So working out ways that we can do that.
I'm kind of thinking through safety of audiences, quality of experience, and actually how we can bring people back together safely.
Try and find positive solutions that we can't not just share with each other, but share more broadly with the community.
It's really made clear how important arts and culture are, and how it's a vital part of the city, and how we all really need to get behind it.
We really need everybody to come to the table to make sure that we're taking care of what it is to be part of a community. We're taking care of social connections that help us through all kinds of adversity.
We just have to keep on going, and hopefully that we'll meet together under a mirror ball again soon.
So that's a bit of a window into the context for the accelerator, and thanks again to the terrific team of 8 participants. And also there was some specialists who came and participated in that in the accelerator. We call them provocateurs, and you might have seen a bit of Jean-Frédéric Levesque in there. He's the head of the COVID intelligence unit for New South Wales Health. So look, I guess a bit of a disclaimer here is that the accelerator that we got to run was 2.5 days, and so obviously if we had had more time, we could have developed things a bit further. But I guess just to say, this is the beginning of the conversation, and we've done a bit of an insights report which we can send out. We'll send a summary and then you can get the full report afterwards, and it's just open source. But really that is also just a bit of a stimulation to how we can keep this conversation alive. So you can see that our focus here is on the public domain. So the kinds of things that we're talking about when we talk about arts and culture in the public domain, they might be festivals, they might be temporary art installations, public art, they might be parades or protests or chess in the park. There's a whole range of things, as we know. These things all have a bit of an intrinsic value that is just not replaceable with an online digital solution, because they offer a collective experience, they offer a kind of random interaction. There's an anticipation when you're going to something like that about meeting up with your friends, and there's the actual meeting up with your friends and strangers. There's moving your body in strange ways. Some people call it dancing. You might have seen me doing a bit in the background there. There's also the option to sort of be a better version of yourself when you're out in this new public space. So it all sounds very dangerous, doesn't it? With our COVID ears on, and under COVID, it's potentially dangerous. And it's also, actually, if you do it with more than 19 people, it's illegal. The public health order that we have in place from about April means that no more than 20 people can gather in the public domain unless you have an exemption for that public health order. We do know that we're anticipating that there'll be a new public health order probably at the end of this month, which might make some changes to this. While the prohibitions have been really effective in solving the physical disease, they've also sparked a greater kind of malaise, which is around a slow-growing malaise. And you heard Jean-Frédéric identify this kind of the anxiety that comes with COVID. And the mental health has a very real cost in terms of our functional capacity as a community. And if you know anybody who's lived on their own in a flat through a lockdown or 2 lockdowns, you'll have a very clear measure of what that's like. So look, I'm going to talk to Fiona and Chris now. Just before I get there, I'll just say 3 things. We know that the outdoor environment is the safer option for mingling and that it's restorative for our health during COVID. We know that from years of research that arts and culture are actually very beneficial. There's indisputable results that show an improvement in people's mental health through arts and cultural activities. And the third thing I'll just say is that Australia typically has a very poor record of supporting the development of outdoor arts and culture. And so this is surely an opportunity for this moment in time, is surely an opportunity for us to start to improve on that, and for the public domain to really serve us all. So how do we do it? Fiona? So look, as I mentioned, you're currently the Director of Programming at Sydney Opera House, but we know that you've run all the programs for Sydney Festival, you're across all of that programming, similarly at the performance space. So you've got a whole massive body of work as a practicing artist, in indoor spaces, in gallery spaces, in outdoor spaces. Can you tell us a bit about what the impact of COVID was for you on your current work, and what would ordinarily be happening if there was no pandemic for you? And now, given that's all happening, what are the priorities? So what are you trying to grapple with?
Yeah, it's, I guess at the Opera House, what we would normally be doing right now is, 6 or 7 shows a night across all of the different venues at the Opera House, and programming into the future. So obviously with the Opera House closed, that's not possible. What we are doing instead is planning and making changes to those plans, and making more changes to those plans as we scenario plan when we might open, and what the regulations might be, and how they might ease as we saw them kind of in the process of close down. Is it going to be parallel? So we're constantly kind of thinking about that, and particularly about the safety of our audiences and our artists and our crew and all of our team. So how are we going to do this safely when we do open? We're also running a digital program, so we are still programming, and for us that was a really important decision to turn the Joan Sutherland Theatre into a digital studio and be offering local artists work at the same time as connecting with our traditional and non-traditional audiences. So it's been really important in terms of offering all different kinds of work to our audiences, obviously in the digital domain. So it is a public domain, albeit digital, and that's been free, and it's been fantastic to do. I guess though, you know, the big challenge for us is actually thinking about what is the future going to be. There is no snapback. So what is the snap forward? And we're looking at that from an artistic perspective, from an economic perspective, because the economics are going to change dramatically, and from a safety perspective and an audience experience perspective.
So, I mean, you're in very different contexts actually, because Chris, you know, the studio Chris Fox has just done this. I just opened actually. I think you opened it just before we did the accelerator. This fantastic new work, the Interchange Pavilion in South Everleigh. People will, of course, know you from the interloop work that you did for the Wynyard Station, that fantastic reconfiguration of the wooden escalators. So how has, I imagine it's impacted you very differently in your kind of work. How has COVID changed your work, and can you see an effect on the future in terms of how it will shape your priorities in your work?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I mean, I think the bulk of the work that I'm doing in the studio is in design construction and building construction industry. So that was quite a particular exemption at the first lockdown in Sydney particularly. We were able to continue, and that was a very strange part of the project where we're doing the project down at South Everleigh for the Interchange Pavilion, and we were really in the bulk of the construction on site. But the entire precinct shut down, and yet we were still able to continue in that mode of building construction. So that was a pretty strange occurrence in terms of how the crew was working and how we were able to try and keep that project continuing. I think there was a direct impact in terms of program. Obviously everything pushed out. We had particular materials coming from overseas, from Indonesia and Singapore, so that was delayed. We had border concerns in relation to crew coming from Brisbane that then had to quarantine or stay in Sydney for extended periods of time before they could go back, and so that was quite complicated. Principally, we were able to continue, but it just extended the project. I mean, I think the work I do in the studio is, at this stage, seemingly continuing. I think there's obviously going to be broader economic impacts in relation to commissioned public artwork and the way in which that is currently placed in relation to the contribution that private developers have to do, or if it's in the public domain for government, local, state, or ideally federal. There's a potential for that to be a more engaged involvement. So I think we, at this stage, are in a continuum, but I think the long game is quite at risk. I think there's a really big change that needs to happen. I mean, I think from the other side of what I do is teaching at University of Sydney. Seeing the impact on the tertiary sector for education has been insane, and I think trying to run the first year architecture program that I do in the first semester and that transitioning, I think seeing that sector have to be so agile and move so quickly, and now the subsequent impacts of that. I think we're seeing crossovers between all these different sectors, and I think they are all very much linked.
Yeah, look, I think what's interesting in terms of the public domain area is, you know, because as you've sort of flagged, you know, there's a whole range of things that happen in the public domain, and when we're in the accelerator, as you'll remember, we were looking at various different contexts. We were looking at the kind of the big gig festival. We were looking at the smaller kind of activation, everyday activation that might happen in a place like South Everleigh, you know, and typically there might be a range of programming that happens there. Or we're also looking at what happens when things go hyper-local. And we're really tackling this idea of what is irreplaceable. I want to just go now to some of the meat of what we were talking about in the accelerator, which was really, there were three areas that our conversations tended to cluster around. And there were things around arts practice and changes to arts practice. The second one was sort of changes to the public space, changes, you know, how public domain is actually going to respond to this context. And also really looking at the nuts and bolts of economic and regulatory support and how we can, you know, advocate for some change there. So Fiona, look, I just wanted to flag this, typically in the public domain, and some of the things that you have on the forecourt or that you've done elsewhere, they do this. They try to bring audiences and artists and passers-by all together in this kind of free association, and they encourage ways for us to mix together. So that has to change. And in the Accelerator, we discuss a bunch of considerations around how arts practice itself has to change. It's not just about putting line markings out and keeping people within the lines. It's actually about how people make projects for that context. Can you pick some of the eyes out of what we discussed in the Accelerator and talk about a few of those potential changes?
Yeah, look, I think one of the things that we talked about a lot was the mobility of artists and audiences. So, there's the mobility of artists in terms of border closures, but then at the events themselves, if we have all the artists here, we're lucky enough to have all the artists here and the audiences, it's actually how do we manage what we have to do in terms of contact tracing. So, is it about fencing? Is it, how do we make sure that we know who's there? But then also, how do we make sure that the free association is limited, I guess. Moving artists around, so audiences stay in the same place, but artists move. So kind of getting rid of the single point of focus being one stage. Do you actually have multiple stages? Or do you do events where you can actually see from a long distance? So we're talking big and high rather than single focus stage at kind of eye level. So we talked about those things and whether we move audiences all in and we kind of have to think about how we're going to create the arc of experience for the audience differently, so that maybe they all come in one area. They don't all come in at the same time. They come in staggered over time periods. And there have been many examples of art projects that have done this in the past. So we can draw on those, but we need to kind of escalate them to another kind of place. And then the audience moves through different space and has different experiences on the way. So we talked about that kind of thing. I think we also talked a bit about decentralising arts experiences, and I think do we, instead of doing one large big spectacle, can we do 15 small events in parks around the suburbs? And we've just seen a really great example of that with the Brisbane Festival, that did an event which was going to 190 different parks across across Brisbane, and having a touring truck that actually had a local artist do a music performance in that space. So people either followed it religiously online and worked out where to go, so that they could see the artist they were interested in, or go to their local park and see what was there, who was playing. But also people actually encountered it. So I think they encountered it because they happened to be in the park with their kids. So I think that thinking about art products that are not necessarily about one destination is a kind of another way of thinking about it. I mean, I also think that I think that dance and circus and the art forms that are very specifically about intimacy of bodies are also really challenged in this space. And so how do people do that? And Emma Saunders, who was in our lab, actually, you saw in the video, looked at how do we actually get people moving and dancing in public safely. So there's all different kinds of things that were discussed, and yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that thing about Emma, because one of the things she said at the end of the Accelerator, she was like, this has been great to be in the room with a whole bunch of programmers and producers and things, and a lot of the people in the room did have arts practice backgrounds, but we're not necessarily doing that at the moment. Yeah. But she was like, we need this process for artists to be thinking about their practice specifically. And that's one of the things that I guess I mentioned at the top, that Australia doesn't and hasn't supported the outdoor arts and cultural sector very well traditionally. And if you look at the big festivals that happen, and you've run one of them, you've been involved in one of them, of course, so the big ticket sort of free events that happen at those festivals are largely from outside of this country, and they get a whole range of support. That won't be happening. So how do we ensure excellence is a question. And I guess I just wanted to flag the idea that, those places like, the UK or France or Scandinavia or the States, whatever, they have dedicated centres that actually foster the development. They broker between producers, they run residencies for artists, they work as an information network. There are models that can help with this, and so I guess this is an opportunity for us more broadly to be advocating for that. And I'll be very interested after, if people are interested in that idea, it'd be great to sort of rally some support around that. Look, I want to talk a bit about this idea of public space with you, Chris, because some of the work you do is in this, you were talking about South Everleigh, it's a public place, but it's a privately owned public place also. There is this kind of changing face of what we know as private spaces, and we know that the CBD is very empty, for example, at the moment. There are a lot of private public spaces that are quite empty. Do you think COVID represents a bit of an opportunity for rethinking the public domain, what we consider as a public domain?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always this slippage between public and private, and I think there's the work that I do, and the South Everleigh one you mentioned is quite interesting. It's a Mirvac site, so it's actually a private land, but then it's public domain. So even the roads are sort of private, and then it connects into the local government. So City of Sydney, there is overlay in terms of City of Sydney management and public art strategy. So there's involvement with carriage works and a pretty involved understanding of that public domain. But I think in the end, it's a real opportunity for private development, and particularly now in this time that government obviously needs to take the first step, and there's intention there. I think there's discussion that we're seeing in Melbourne particularly. State government is talking about the way in which the public domain and all the streets around the CBD of Melbourne are really going to be turned over to all the food and beverage along the main areas to allow for that COVID-safe dining. So there's an intention there, but I think it needs to go further, and we're seeing it here in the city. There's temporary bike lanes, and so I think there's a climate now where people are seeing the importance of it. The CBD, as you mentioned, is principally dead. It's just there is really hardly any activity there. There's obviously no commercial capacity in terms of all the offices, but we're seeing the impact in terms of the city streets. So I think there really needs to be a potential where state and then local government need to think about a governance around the way in which we're thinking about our roads, our lanes, our parks. But I think the interesting part, which goes to your question, is there's also pockets of private land which are either potentially in transition for development, but more importantly moving into development, or even with an existing use which is now becoming redundant. How can that space become more activated for the city? How can that be a potential for people to still have connectedness? We need more space. Principally this notion around 1.5 metres and the 20-person maximum principally determines that we need much more space to do anything. To have points of connectedness, we then need to rethink the way we use our city, and I think the private sector has a really important role to play, and perhaps they're the quickest to be able to act as well. We see an intention with government, but I think the private sector has a potential to really offer up a part of their space to run a festival. It could be an initiative that is set up to have arts and culture on a sort of a monthly basis in their site. So I think there's an opportunity which can potentially give kudos and reputation to that particular private sector entity, but it's an opportunity then, I think, to really take on arts and culture as a crucial thing for our city and our well-being.
So you mentioned something interesting there, which is about, I guess, nimbleness, nimbility, I don't know what it is. So one of the things that we talked about was this idea of regulation, and actually it's been very interesting to see governments act quite fast, compared to how typically those things happen.
That's right.
So the last area we've got in the report is really around this idea of economic and regulatory support. And some of the ideas that we discussed in the accelerator were things such as like a shared COVID-safe outdoor festival environment. If you think of there's a whole range of things that happen in the Domain, or the whole range of things that happen in Parramatta Park. typically the producing organisation has to do all of they're all doing their own, running their own little races, and whether that's liquor licensing or DAs or all of those kind of things. You put the COVID lens over the top of that and you've got a very complex, almost unworkable thing going on. So I guess, Fiona, I have a question for you around what do you think needs to be considered when we start to think about collaborative models that might help with this kind of new context that we're in?
Yeah, look, I think there needs to be lots more collaboration between what we currently kind of think of as the subsidised sector and the commercial sector. We're all interested in actually being able to do events again, and we recognise the social value of that, whether they're paid events or free events. So I think it's actually, again, about collaborating to say, well, what can we do here? What's the infrastructure that's needed? Who's going to help pay for it? Because the economy is completely shifted. So if we think about the fact that, you know, one space normally fits 20,000 people, well, maybe now with social distancing it fits 4,000 or maybe 10,000. So that's half the, you know, if we're lucky, that's half the number of audience. And then, you know, and then cleaning and security and all of those things. So we have to completely rethink the economy, but we need to do that sort of collaboratively. And I think partnerships between commercial and non-commercial are really important to be able to do that. And there are examples of it. I mean, Sydney Festival did the infrastructure for the Domain for many years. It doesn't anymore, but that sort of served carols by candlelight and opera in the Domain and contemporary music concerts. And, you know, so there are examples of that. We just need to kind of go back there and work out who is going to help us do this, because actually the economy is changed.
Yeah, and as you flagged it before when we were talking about art forms changing, the expectations of everybody is changing, whether that's audiences or sponsors or any of those. All the
That's
metrics
right.
are all different now.
We need to really rethink what is the value, who's valuing it, and why is it important, and who's going to help pay for it. You
mentioned a highly legal activity a moment ago, which was carols by candlelight, which is singing in public. Lots of people singing in public is
now 5 metres. We now have to be 5 metres from each other in order to
If we were singing, we won't promise not to break out. But I think that, what happens typically is that most local government areas will have a budget for carols by candlelight, Australia Day, Anzac Day, that's New Year's Eve, and I think it's interesting because a lot of the people who are listening today and watching are from local government areas, and people are sitting there with these budgets for a carols by candlelight budget going, my God. So Chris, I have a provocation for you in thinking, okay, what we talked about is advocating that those budgets don't get absorbed into general revenue, and that we find other interesting, safe, COVID-safe ways to work with those budgets. Just off the top of your head, can you think of a complete reconfiguration of carols by candlelight in a COVID-safe way that, I guess, perhaps, thinking about objects in space, this is what you're doing, isn't it? Think about architecture and space and things. Yeah. You don't have to, of course, break one down, but it's a conversation we'd like to continue. Can you give us a few jams on that kind of perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know if carols by candlelight is front of mind, but in terms of a spatial problem, but perhaps it's coming from the accelerator. We talked a lot about events, and I think, and maybe that goes, maybe the idea of carols is slightly different because it's more complicated with the singing, but I think the event system, if it's not decentralised, which what Fiona talked about, which I think was really interesting about the Brisbane Festival model, which was really interesting. There was sort of these over 100 different venues. If it is a centralised event, it's a spatial problem as well. It's like it's a design problematic that I think is quite interesting and challenging. It's about how can you think about how people can still have a sense of connectedness, but have these potentially pocketed areas. There's some good examples of scaffold events. There was one in Liverpool, which was really quite successful. So I think there's a really interesting way you can think about, for instance, if we talk about the Domain, and maybe that leads into a projection around the carols. If you think spatially around each of these potential pods or moments where people could be in their maximum of 20 people or whatever the particular COVID safe law would be at the time. There could also be a rethinking too about the way we think about the events. We've talked about this almost paradigm shift in relation to how we think about connectedness, how we think about public domain. So there's a lot of changes that need to happen, but maybe it becomes a different spectacle. It's less about, in the carol's circumstance, if we can't initiate the singing, perhaps it's much more about a sculptural outcome or a structure that is symbolic of that particular event. So I mean, there's maybe very different ways we need to think about maintaining arts and culture, the intent of the practitioners and the voices of the artists, but also connectedness and how we can retain that. And that's quite complicated when dancing is already quite problematic. You know, it's a very different time we're in.
Yeah. I mean, I think, can I just add a little bit to that? I think one of the things that we also talked about in the accelerator was, you know, we've got these kind of particular moments in the year, and we have a traditional way of celebrating them, you know, albeit depending on which community we belong to, or which communities we belong to. But it seems to me that, you know, one of our challenges is, you know, what are the new rituals that we can actually make, and how can we encourage artists to drive that and support artists to drive that, so that we might actually, you know, not all want to flock into the city to see the fireworks on New Year's Eve. Maybe there's something else that we want to do. Plant a forest. I mean, you know, find the new rituals and make something of that. I think is actually our big challenge. And, you know, maybe they can be addressing things that are other than COVID that we need to address.
I think
in our culture.
I mean, that's a lovely thing, isn't it, to just turn it on its head a little bit. And I think the Anzac Day actually led the charge.
That's right.
Pardon the pun. But, you know, on that sort of curbside vigil that people did with a candle, I think that was just readily picked up and run with by people. And so it is this idea of a new collective ritual, and how can we start to play with that. I think that the thing that you were touching on here is about arts practice, and the flip side, or the other side of the coin for arts practice, is about audiences, isn't it? And so maybe, I mean, and I'll just sort of flag quickly, if anybody does have any questions, please send them through, and we'll go to some of those questions. I did see one down there, we'll come to in a second. But I wanted to just talk about this idea of audience expectations.
I think we're going to have to work with our audiences really carefully. We need to change our behaviours, and you know, we've done it kind of. You know, I've never used so much hand wash, you know, whatever it's called.
That's right.
You know, we've changed some of our behaviours, and when we go back into the public domain or into theatres or whatever, but back into the public domain, we need to actually be aware, and we still impulse to hug, or, you know, all of those things. So actually, what are the things we need to stop doing and be more aware about? And it will happen. I mean, we can do that. But then in terms of the consumption of culture, or the participation in culture, I think, you know, we do need to work with our audiences about different expectations. And I was looking at, there was a story in yesterday's paper about a theatre in Madrid. So it was an indoor space, but it was a theatre in Madrid, and they weren't socially distanced, and the audience actually stood up and said no. And I thought, oh, that's kind of really interesting, because we talked about actually how we work with an audience to kind of be, to observe all of the stuff that they need to observe safely. So I think there will be a point at which audiences say what they need to, but we need to support them in that kind of shift of behaviours and expectations.
It's a negotiation, isn't it? Because actually every time somebody puts on a play or puts on a whatever, they are educating, or they're leading their audiences where to look, where to sit, where to, you know. And so it's a dance between the arts practitioners and the people looking, you know, and the audience members. I mean, the question that came in, I think from the Circus Solaris team, is around bringing artists into the conversation early. Let me just see if I'm getting that right.
Yes.
Yep, so it's not just about, the question is here, we're always thinking on our feet and developing ideas with the next gig in mind. Can we bring artists in early and into the mix and not just producers? And so, and they also sort of this idea of being given an opportunity to develop works further can start to produce a different culture in the public domain. Can you talk, Fiona, a little bit about any of that kind of process that you might have been going through in terms of generating a work? I know, for example, you had talked to Emma or things about how those things might be configured. What is the to and fro that needs to happen in this new context?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one that I don't think we're very good at yet. But I think it is a matter of saying, it is a matter of bringing the artists in early and actually going, well, you know, your practice has changed, our practice has changed, you know, what can we actually manage in this space or to this end? So I think, and I don't think we're really there yet because we don't know what the next kind of phase is. And I think that this kind of space we've been in, which is, you know, what's it going to look like? I mean, I think this is where the accelerator was really important because it was a conversation that actually meant we could think about it from different perspectives because of who was in the room. And I think that a good deal of that, more of that needs to happen. And when you were talking about a local council having a budget, I mean, that can no longer do the things that they do, I would have thought that would be a great opportunity for a conversation with local artists about, you know, what we can do. This is the kind of support we've got. Ideally, we'd like to be in this park or whatever, or talk to this community.
But I think, yeah, going to that point around artist engagement, I think there's a really important point now that we're in, that and yet the whole premise of the accelerator and your intro is really about mental health and the importance art and culture has. So hopefully there's a momentum that supports that. I think, and the fact that you pointed to the fact that there isn't as much support historically in Australia in relation to arts and culture. I think artists need to be more and more part of the conversation, and artists are generally experts. They're experts of their field, of exactly what they do across the whole sector. So there's an opportunity for artists to really join that conversation and start to advise, start to be involved. So there's an indication of what could work in terms of a particular event or particular project, or it could even be in relation to a very particular artist practice, you know. And so I think that conversation is really important, that we need to start to support that. And I think, again, it's going to be back to government to start to stimulate that, to provide more grants, to provide more support to be able to allow that to happen.
And for our institutions to invite artists in more.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's, I think for an organisation that is an arts-based organisation like the Opera House, that's an easy thing to pick up in some ways because you're talking those relationships all the time. And I think maybe, Chris, in some of the work that you're doing, you know, you're working with people who are, you know, they are thinking about the place that they're developing the whole time and what they want, the pedestrian flows, or what they want in terms of, you know, activation and in those places to be like. For some people working in the cultural section of a local government, there's not a lot of, you know, some of those people are going pretty hard on their own actually. And so I guess the question is, how does that dialogue, how do we facilitate those conversations? Because there are, as you say, it's about getting artists into the conversation, but there's a bit of a brokerage role there that I think is a missing link in some ways.
Yeah.
Look, there is a question here that's come through around, okay, look, while we're still now, so I'll read this one out. So it's from Pippa Bailey. And she says, one big challenge is enabling artists to be fast-tracked and supported to act quickly. Funding systems have generally been so slow and production takes so long. So how do we help to be more nimble and dynamic in this space? Any thoughts?
Well, I think there was points you made in terms of precedents in Europe, particularly Northern Europe. There's excellent precedents in relation to bodies that are set up particularly in relation to public events, public festivals, and that then advises the way in which we think about public space. And that's happened historically, and now I think has a really active role in this current climate. So I think there's direct action that needs to be taken, like we've talked about in terms of government, but yes, big cultural institutions as well. There needs to be an understanding, I think, around how there can be a sort of structure that artists can be involved, but more importantly, how we're sort of thinking about not only our current events, but future events. So it's almost like a spatial and time mapping. It's almost as though we need to think about a calendar, think about the seasons, think about the particular key events. Can those events slide or open up? And then what can that now be thought of spatially in not just the CBD, but then if we're talking about Sydney, Greater Sydney, for instance. And I think there's quite a lot to develop and understand, because it's actually a rethinking of all of those structures that are often siloed to the big events that are apexed around the harbour. You know, that model is no longer sustainable.
I think, I mean, I've just got another kind of comment, which is really, I mean, I agree that this is a real issue. And I mean, if we imagine that there were a lab like Accelerator, but bigger, with a lot more artists and people involved, but actually that it was backed by a range of local governments. And so not only was there a lab where future thinking and collaboration kind of can occur, but there's money behind it, so that straight out of the lab, 4 ideas can be researched and then 2 go to production or something like that. So again, it's kind of requiring collaboration at a bigger level in order to invest in the research and development that can happen quickly. So that's the kind of thing that I think would be fantastic.
That's a great idea, those kind of networks. And I know there was a network between some of the festivals that was run out of Tasmania. I think it was called Insight, maybe? I think it was an Insight collaborative framework. I don't know whether it still runs, but that's those kind of networking models that are good for artist development and also good for making, you know, co-collaborative models for making work, I think is really on.
And there is the Major Festivals Initiative, which could actually partly support that actually, but usually it's about artists pitching their ideas. It would be great to actually do a lab that then, you know, festival directors were involved with and backed.
I mean, I think that, you know, I'll have a quick look to see if there's another comment. We need to wrap soon, but just want to leave people enough time to get out of the pyjamas to go to the next meeting, whatever it might be. So the Australia Council has got a paper out at the moment called Reimagine. You can make a submission to that with recommendations, and I think this kind of thing that we're talking about is really where there's potential for us to be thinking collectively around this issue. Just have a quick look at the chat here, because there was a comment here about public events in terms of Indigenous representation, which is very interesting, because actually at the beginning of the accelerator, we heard from Lizzie Barrett and Paddy Gibson, who were a couple of the organisers from the Black Lives Matter rallies, and so we're really tackling things on a whole other level in terms of elders' safety and, you know, a whole bunch of things. You can imagine what that process was like. So yeah, it did very much inform our thinking. It was a real kind of fire in the belly kind of moment for us all at the beginning of the accelerator to be hearing from them. We've got 4 minutes. I'm just going to have a quick thing. Okay, there's one here from Dan Rook, who runs a terrific little festival in Tasmania. Well, little, it's, you know, it's still 2,000 or 3,000 people that how you reimagine that when a small bit of rural Tasmania is a lot of grappling, I'm sure, going on down there. So he says, more thoughts on how arts orgs collaborate or get support from the government or private sector. We found that the arts sector are having to self-organise because everyone is so focused on their own industries, which that is the world we're really living in, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a really important point.
I mean, I'm not putting city people's hand up to be an organiser here, but I think that the potential for this conversation to kind of start to push some bigger buttons is a very interesting one. So if people are interested in that, it'd be great to hear. Look, I just want to do some a quick wrap up until where we're going from here. So firstly, thank you to you two for coming in today, and thank you for being in the accelerator, and to the other people that were in the accelerator. Really, thank you so much for just jumping into the unknown, because it is a very strange conundrum that we're all dealing with, and it was great to have some thinking in the room from those people. Also the provocateurs who came along to stimulate our thinking, so really thank you to them. Thanks to the City of Sydney who supported this accelerator, and to 107 Projects who were our venue partner. And thank you very much to the Story Mill for really supported us with the webinar and the video pieces for this work. What we will do from here is that we have got a summary of the Insight report. It's a sort of 3 or 4 page document which we'll shoot out to everybody who's registered today via email. You can have a read of that. That'll lead you can then click on a link to the full Insight report, which is, it's about sort of 25 pages or so. It lays out the thinking, the rationale, the drivers in a bit more detail, and that'll just be free and it'll be on our website. I guess just also to say, we're very interested to hear what this is like for people, not just as the format of the webinar, but whether this conversation can continue. So we'll shoot out also a bit of a survey. If you've got any thoughts on that and about how we can continue this, it'd be great to hear. So we'll put a link in with the report that we sent out. I don't think there's anything else we have to add. Should I be saying anything else that I've forgotten? No, looking around the room. Thank you so much, Fiona. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you.
See you all soon.